BIOL5 week 4, and today we're talking about the musculoskeletal system. So this is a reflection of the fact that we're getting into section 2, which has to do with organ systems. Even though we're kind of changing sections, we're still building up on a lot of material that we talked about over the past few weeks. So we're going to continue kind of revisiting some of the material we talked about with cells and tissues and building up on that to get into organs and organ systems. You might have heard about the muscular system and the skeletal system separately. Today we're going to kind of talk about them as separate entities, but also talk about the ways in which they integrate and also how they integrate with the nervous system. So even though all of these systems of the body are maybe studied separately, they still integrate together and work with one another to help the body function. So just keep that in mind. Musculoskeletal it sounds like a fancy word, but it's just the muscular system and the skeletal system working together to accomplish certain functions. Before we get into today's lecture, I wanted to talk about the reflection that we had about cell signaling. So I had you watch a video. I defined transcription factor as a protein that binds to DNA, which regulates how that DNA codes for messenger RNA. So I know that some of you probably learned about the relationship between DNA and protein quite some time ago. Maybe some of these terms are familiar to you, maybe they're not. That's okay. So I just want to first encourage you, whenever something seems confusing, that's really what science is about, is being curious, recognizing your confusion, sitting with it, and then trying to figure out the answer. And I know that for a lot of you in high school especially, I'm sure biology was taught in a way where you could look up the answer, maybe it was the definition of a term, and just fill it in and then right away have it figured out. In science, it doesn't really work that way, and that's why we do students a disservice by teaching them biology in that format. Things are confusing and no one is there to tell you, yes, you solved this mystery, you figured out the answer. So when I ask you questions where the answer doesn't seem apparent, especially if it's in a reflection where you're not being graded on the answer, it's probably because I want you to be curious and think about things in different ways and be creative. And I know that creativity is not necessarily something people think about in relation to science, but that is kind of how we're going to approach this class at times. So just to review a few main points about reflection number 3. Some key ideas are that human cells don't exist individually. They're bound together as tissue. That's something that we've talked about in past weeks. It's an idea that we're going to continue thinking about today. The fact that cells can interact with each other and form tissue involves cell signaling, which was a big component of last week's lecture. And like I just talked about, sometimes different words are used for the same idea. Everything in biology builds on itself, and there's going to be times you don't know everything, and that's totally okay. So when we talk about transcription factors, maybe that sounds like something that's completely unfamiliar to you, but it involves a cell response to cell signals, which was definitely something we talked about last week. So just because something seems foreign or confusing doesn't mean it is. You know a lot more than you give yourself credit for. Just sit with it for a moment, be creative, and try to figure it out. So these are some slides from last week. Remember that we talked about how signaling molecules send messages to target cells. Those signaling molecules are also called ligands. These are very small molecules that can bind to receptors on the outside of a cell and cause some effect within the cell. Remember that the target cells have a specific receptor. We talked about glycoproteins, we talked about structural components on the outside of a plasma membrane. So the target cells that the ligand is trying to find have that receptor, the ligand binds to the receptor, and then there's a cell response. So that's what we just talked about. ligand binds to receptor, that's called signal perception. There's some cascade, maybe a primary transcription factor and a secondary transcription factor, and then some sort of cellular response. So to answer prompt 1, how does this video relate to the lecture material for this week? There were a few different points. The first was, it talks about the structure of the plasma membrane. There's glycoproteins, there's cell receptors. It talks about cell signaling. There are ligands, there are cell receptors, and there's a cell response. Then we also talked quite a bit about tonicity, so whether a solution is hypertonic, isotonic, or hypotonic. And this video talks about how the concentration of material outside of the cell makes a difference in terms of the cell response. So it also ties in this idea that we talked about last week. There's also some other material in the course that got brought up in this video. In week 2, we talked about the structure of DNA and the structure of protein. Those are very different molecules, but they also have a very closely related functional element to them. When we talk about DNA expression, when we talk about mitosis and meiosis, these ideas will kind of come into play a little bit more. Later in the semester, we're also going to talk about stem cells and mitosis, so that's an idea that is also related to this video. The reason for that is on the next slide. So we go from being a single cell to large creatures with different types of tissue. How do you think the mechanisms shown in this video help us in this growth process? So all of the cells in our body have the same code. They all have the same DNA. Stem cells have the ability to differentiate into many different types of cells based on what types of proteins are produced. So if you haven't heard of stem cells before, you might have heard of them in a context other than a biology class. But stem cells are cells that are found in umbilical cords, in adult tissue, but then also readily available in embryos. So in meiosis, we produce a sperm and an egg. Those sperm and egg come together to form a new offspring. And as that offspring develops and starts going through mitosis and making copies of its cells, it forms these stem cells. And the stem cells have the ability to turn into many different types of cells. So they're kind of like those Pokemon that can evolve into different types of other Pokemon, like Eevee. So depending on the stimulus, they can kind of go in one direction. They can't go back to being a stem cell, but they can differentiate and then go on to become a specific type of tissue. So in that video, we saw that the concentration gradients of signaling molecules and cell responses helps us develop unique cells and tissues that makes us fully formed organisms. So later in the semester, when we talk about mitosis, when we talk about stem cells, keep this cell signaling in mind because that's how that's actually accomplished. Okay, so getting into chapter 38, the musculoskeletal system, I'm going to start by kind of revisiting some slides from last week to remind you of some ideas and then get into the actual lecture material. So remember, there are 4 types of tissue. There's epithelial tissue, connective tissue, muscle, and nervous tissue. So today we're going to focus pretty heavily on connective tissue because bone is a type of connective tissue. We'll get into muscle tissue towards the end, and then we'll briefly talk about nervous tissue because that's how muscle tissue actually moves. Remember that when we talked about connective tissue, there were different types of connective tissue. There's connective tissue proper. There's more fluid connective tissue, which includes blood and lymph. And then there's supporting connective tissue like cartilage and bone. Cartilage is found quite a bit in bone, and it's important for bone to develop. Bone is a type of connective tissue. We're going to be talking a lot about bone tissue today. And remember that a defining characteristic of all connective tissues is that the cells are dispersed in some matrix. So when we talk about the structure of bone tissue, we'll talk about the actual bone cells, which start with the prefix osteo. Whenever you see osteo or ossa, that's referring to bone. So those bone tissue or bone cells, the different osteocytes, are suspended in a matrix, and we'll talk about what that matrix, what that ground substance actually is in a little bit. So remember that bone is living tissue. It's a supporting connective tissue. It has several types of living cells building up and breaking apart a non-living matrix. The bone that you see pictured here is compact bone. Whenever you see those circles, those osteon, that is referring to a specific type of bone called compact bone. So remember also that muscle tissue allows for movement. It's very excitable. It can respond to a stimulus. It's also contractile, so it shortens and it pulls usually bone around. So there's different types of muscle. There's skeletal, cardiac, and smooth. When we talk about the musculoskeletal system, we're talking about the relationship between bone and skeletal muscle. We'll briefly talk about cardiac and smooth muscle today just to remind you of some of those characteristics, but usually when we talk about the type of muscle that moves bone, we're talking about the skeletal muscle. Okay, so to get into chapter 38, we'll start by talking about 38.1, which is types of skeletal systems. We'll skip ahead and talk about bone as a tissue, and then get back into types of skeletal systems. Then we'll get into joints, also called articulations, and skeletal movement, and then talk briefly about muscle contraction and locomotion. We'll talk about this kind of in a bigger gross anatomy sense, but the actual kind of signaling involved with muscle contraction we'll focus on more when we talk about the nervous system. Okay, so this is a slide that you've seen before. Remember that we've already talked about cells. This is the smallest independently functioning unit of a living organism. We scaled up to talk about tissue, and now we're going to focus on organs, which are anatomically distinct structures that have at least two tissue types, and organ systems, which are groups of organs that work together. So when we're thinking about what a skeleton actually is, this is any structure, and really it's an organ system that supports the body, protects internal organs, and allows for movement of the organism. So you have been alive in your body for many years now. You have a familiarity of what bones actually are, but skeleton is a very broad word. So remember, we talked about the cytoskeleton when we talked about cell structures. So that's a set of protein filaments that are inside of our cells that help support it, protect it, and allow for movement. And that's within the cell itself. That's a cytoskeleton. You might also be familiar with the exoskeletons of insects that are shed. And there's even human exoskeletons. There are these structures that people can wear to help support them, give them strength, allow for movement if their movement is compromised in some way. Those are artificial, of course. So when we have different types of animals other than humans, there's a couple of different types of skeletons. There's a hydrostatic skeleton, which is common in earthworms. It's a fluid cavity, and muscles kind of move around that fluid and kind of constrict it in different ways to allow for movement. An exoskeleton is a hard external structure on the outside of different arthropods like insects and also things like lobsters and crabs. Usually it's formed mostly from chitin. Things like lobsters also have calcium carbonate as part of that exoskeleton. In us, we have an endoskeleton. So exo means outside of, their skeleton is outside of their body. Endo means inside. So our skeleton is inside of our body. It's a hard mineralized structure. Remember that that bone matrix, that ground substance, has minerals in it. And so these are structures that are located within our soft tissue. There are some things like our teeth, which emerge from that soft tissue, but those are still inside of our mouths. So when we're thinking about different types of bone, there's ways that we can categorize them. And so one very basic way we can start to organize bones and think about them structurally and then functionally is by shape. And each bone shape, it turns out, has a distinct function. So remember, in biology, there's a relationship between structure and function. They inform one another. So there's flat bones, irregular bones, short bones, sesamoid bones, and long bones. And when we look at those different functions, the long bones are things like on our limbs or our clavicles, which are our collarbones. And these are levers, basically. They kind of move like a lever to move muscles around. And so that definition is kind of weird because the muscles are what's actually pulling on the bones, but the fact that you have these levers in place allows that to kind of be a cohesive process. Short bones are there for stability, so those are like in our feet and our hands. Flat bones are points of attachment and protection. So for example, your sternum in the center of your chest is a flat bone, and all of your ribs articulate or connect to that sternum. Irregular bones provide protection from compressive forces, and sesamoid bones protect our tendons. So that's something like your patella, your kneecap. So if we're looking at a long bone, like for example, your femur, which is your upper leg bone, it's the biggest bone in your body, there's a distinct shape to it. So it's kind of narrow and long in the center, and then there's these kind of rounded components on either side. So those rounded components are called the epiphysis. There are some terms in the slides that come from anatomy, and since a lot of you are taking Bio5 as a prerequisite to anatomy, I want to start practicing using them, even though I won't be testing you on them. So for example, that term proximal, it means closest to the trunk of your body. So if something is approximate, it's close, or if something's a proxy, it's acting closely to something else. And then distal, you should think about like distance. That's something that's farther away from the point of attachment to your body. So we have a proximal epiphysis and a distal epiphysis. If this is your femur, the proximal epiphysis is where it attaches to your hip bones, and then the distal epiphysis is at your knee. The center part of this bone, that is the long part of the bone, is the diaphysis. So that ranges from the proximal epiphysis to the distal epiphysis. So the kind of outside portion of the bone that's surrounding it is called a compact bone. In the center, there's an open cavity, which is filled with yellow bone marrow. And so that's called the medullary cavity. It's hollow, and then it's filled with yellow marrow. The color of that marrow matters because yellow marrow is specifically there to store fat. It also plays a role with stem cells, whereas red marrow, oh, sorry, I switched to the next slide too soon, but you can kind of see it in that spongy bone at the epiphysis. Red bone marrow is important for forming different types of blood cells. So it forms red blood cells, white blood cells. It's important for the creation of blood cells. So when we're looking at this proximal epiphysis, there's a few things that we can see. There's articular cartilage. So when you see that word, it kind of looks like a lot to process, but remember that cartilage is just a type of connective tissue. The word articular comes from articulate or articulation, which is a connection, it's a joint. So when you have the bone connecting to something else, you have articular cartilage, which protects the bone, reduces friction, and absorbs shock. You also have something called an epiphyseal line. So if you've heard of growth plates or growth lines, that's what this is referring to. The bone is a living, changing entity, and it has to go from being very small when you're an infant to being very long when you're a fully formed adult. And so your bone has to lengthen over time. And that happens at these growth plates, which are made of cartilage when you're young, and then eventually become an epiphyseal line when your growth stops, when your bones stop lengthening, and it's replaced by osseous tissue or bone tissue. So it goes from being cartilage to being bone. Okay, so when we're thinking about what cells actually make up the bone tissue itself, not the marrow, but the bone, there's 4 different types of cells. There's osteocytes, osteoblasts, osteogenic cells, and osteoclasts. So all of those cells are embedded in collagen, which provides flexibility, and then also it has different minerals mixed in, which provide hardness and strength. So bones have to be somewhat flexible. They have to be able to bend a little bit, deal with compressive forces before they actually break, but they do need to be reinforced. So if you have too much flexibility, then you don't have enough strength in your bones. But if you have too many minerals, too much hardness and strength, then your bones don't have enough flexibility and can break fairly easily. They become very brittle. So when we're thinking about the role of those different types of cells, it looks like a lot to memorize, but let's take a moment and break it down. So osteo just means bone. It's just telling you these are bone cells. And osteocyte is a very general term. It literally means bone cells because cyte means cell. So these are just general bone cells. Osteoblasts build, so the B you can think about as building, so they're building bone. Osteogenic, genic means creation, so like Genesis, it's the creation of something. So these are stem cells that create more osteocytes. And then there's osteoclasts, which break apart the bone matrix. And so you can think about it like catastrophic. It's destroying the bone matrix. The balance between osteoblasts and osteoclasts is very important. So when we're thinking about the relationship between all of these, there's kind of a process in place. We have those osteoblasts, which are forming new bone. They synthesize and secrete collagen and calcium, so they build up the bone matrix. Osteoblasts build up. And so what's happening there is that osteoblast is building up the bone matrix. It gets trapped by the stuff that it's building. So it's building up basically a wall around itself, and then it becomes just a general type of cell. It's an osteocyte. It's just kind of chilling there. And so because it's trapped itself, the bone has to continue to kind of remodel and form these different matrices. And so you have to get more osteoblasts. That's done using those stem cells, the osteogenic cells. So I mentioned that there has to be a careful balance between osteoblasts and osteoclasts. Osteoblasts are building up the bone matrix. Osteoclasts break it apart by kind of reabsorbing calcium. So there has to be a careful balance between the two. If you have too much osteoclast function, too much breaking it apart, that's how you get something like osteoporosis, which is an increase in the porosity, a decrease in the density of bone tissue. So your bone tissue becomes too porous. That leads to stuff like breakage. It's a very common problem kind of in older women especially, but the alternate can also happen. So with osteoblasts, if they're building up bone too much, that's how you get excess bone growth, bone spurs. I actually had a professor in college whose son had a condition where whenever he got an injury, his body repaired it with bone matrix. So it's called, it's also referred to as like kind of the human statue disease. So basically what happens is that anytime you get an injury, your body builds up bone, so you eventually become basically a giant skeleton. You're made of bone. So it's a very serious and very scary disease. You would think that, we hear so much about osteoporosis and how bad it is. You'd think that building up bone is super good, but there has to be a careful balance between them. Okay, so those were types of bone cells, and then thinking about the bone tissue that is made from those cells, we have compact bone and spongy bone. So compact bone is the one that I showed you earlier where you have those circles. It's very strong, it has those repeating osteons or those repeating units, and it covers the outside of bone. Inside you have spongy bone, which is called cancellous bone. It doesn't have the same circular repeating units, but it's still very important for a lot of function. It is found in the epiphysis. It contains red bone marrow, like I talked about earlier, which is important for making blood cells. So we talked a little bit about bone growth in the context of the epiphyseal plate. Remember that that occurs kind of early on in development. You have the bone lengthening and then also thickening as well. And so we go from being, mostly this cartilage model to being a combination of cartilage and bone to being fully ossified, to being fully bone in our skeletal system. In adulthood, though, it doesn't stop growing. Like I mentioned, there's kind of this remodeling process with the balance between osteoclasts and osteoblasts. So your bone matrix is constantly being built up and broken apart and remodeled. And actually, your skeleton replaces itself about every 10 years. So every 10 years, you have a completely new skeleton. Which is kind of interesting because it makes me think about this idea, this thought experiment called the ship of Theseus, where, if you replace every single piece of a ship, is it still the same ship? And our body is constantly overturning its cells, constantly replacing, for example, the lining of your stomach replaces itself every 4 to 6 days, and your skeleton replaces itself every 10 years. So we're just constantly changing and becoming a completely different, set of cells. And it's a really interesting thing to think about. So when you break a bone, when you have this kind of jarring damage to your skeletal system that's not just normal remodeling, your body has to have a way of resolving that. So what actually happens, keep in mind that, your bone is not dry. It's full of blood vessels. It has to have nerves going in there as well. And so there's a lot of stuff happening inside of bone. So when you break that bone, you also break the blood vessels. The blood vessels break and they clot, just like how when you get a cut, it clots. And so what this does is it stops the flow of blood to your bone cells and deprives them of nutrients. So those bone cells start to die. New capillaries kind of grow in. The clot is also called a hematoma, so just keep that in mind. And so you have them bringing in white blood cells, which can be phagocytotic. They can kind of eat up and break down dead stuff. So those white blood cells are able to clear away dead bone cells, and then spongy bone starts to kind of rebuild itself and reform from different types of cartilage. So again, you have this process of going from cartilage to bone. The cartilage over a period of a few months becomes ossified. The spongy bone formation might take a few days. The ossification takes a few months. And then remodeling starts occurring over a period of months to years. So that's able to kind of reform that medullary cavity, strengthen the compact bone, and hopefully get it back to normal, but sometimes the bone never fully sets correctly. So it has to be lined up before this can really make a connection and rebuild the bone. Okay, so even though we think about the skeleton as being all one system, there's actually some divisions we can make within it, and this kind of ties back to the idea of structure and function. So remember, the skeletal system consists of bones, but there's also, cartilage and what we call ligaments holding it together. Ligaments are made out of connective tissue. They connect bone to other bone. The skeletal system in an adult has 206 different bones. In terms of function, these bones serve to provide support to the body. They store minerals and lipids. The lipids are stored in the yellow marrow, remember, the red marrow produces blood cells. These bones protect internal organs and they allow for movement. So the bone itself is doing a lot of stuff, but in terms of where the bones are located in the body, we can start to divide it into different systems, so different divisions of the skeletal system. And that kind of ties back to the idea of providing support to the body, protecting internal organs, and allowing for movement. So we call these divisions the axial skeletal system and the appendicular skeletal system, or the axial skeleton and the appendicular skeleton. Axial is kind of like the axis. It's the central portion, the central axis of the body. So it's your head, your chest, and your neck and back. So head, neck, chest, and back. There's 80 total bones there. You don't need to memorize that for the quiz or the exam, but you do kind of need to know which bones fall into this axial skeleton. There's a comprehensive list above this lecture, so if you look at what you need to focus on, there's a list of bones that are in the axial skeleton and a list of bones that are in the appendicular skeleton. Obviously, it's not all 80 and 126 of them. It's kind of a simplified look at this. So when we're looking at appendicular, that's like your appendices or appendages. It's your arms, your legs, and the bones that connect those arms and legs to your axial skeleton. So it's the bones of the upper and lower limbs and the bones that attach them. So remember, there's 206 bones in an adult, but there's actually 305 bones in a newborn. You know, when babies are born, they have those soft spots on their head, which are really precious, and I touch my daughters all the time and I'm just like, oh my gosh, your brain is right underneath there. The reason for that is they have to be able to, you know, emerge from the birth canal, and those bones in their brain case kind of slide over each other at those joints, those fixed joints, and then over time they eventually fuse together. So they start out as separate bones, like your temporal bone, your occipital bone, your parietal bone. They slide over each other, and then eventually that cartilage that is kind of between them ossifies, connects itself, and so you actually decrease the number of bones you have because so many of them end up fusing together. So by the time you're an adult, you have about 100 less bones in your body because so many of them have fused together. Okay, so that first division, remember, is the axial skeleton, and its goal is really protection. It protects your brain, it protects your spinal cord, it protects your heart and your lungs, so kind of what's in your thoracic cavity, that chest cavity in your body. The goal of the axial skeleton is really about protection and stability. It also serves as an attachment site for a lot of muscles that move kind of central portions of your body. So your head, your neck, your back, your shoulder, and your hip joints, those muscles all kind of attach to that axial skeleton. So there are muscles that attach to your axial skeleton and then kind of like attach also to your appendicular skeleton. So when you get into anatomy, just keep that in mind. We kind of think about what's called an origin versus an insertion, where it attaches versus what it's actually moving. Okay, so I'm just going to quickly walk through some of the bones that are found in the axial skeleton. You do not need to necessarily memorize all the bones of the brain case. There's just kind of a couple of things to keep in mind. So there's the cranium, that's your skull. It's the brain case, so it's called the cranial vault, which is, you know, like your occipital bone, parietal bone, temporal bone. So the bones that kind of surround your brain, and then also the facial bones in the front of your face. So there's the cranium. There's also, as part of that, the mandible, which is the lower jaw. That's the only one that doesn't fully fuse with the rest of the bones. So everything else fuses together. The mandible is separate, which is how we're able to chew and talk. So those cranial bones are really important for protecting your central nervous system. They protect your brain. There's also a lot of sense organs that are kind of in that area, so your eyes, your nose, your mouth. There's cranial nerves that kind of run through there. And then also things like your inner ear bones actually play a role in sensing as well. So some of the bones that are in that area also are involved in being able to perceive the world around you. So they're not just there for protection, they also play a role in sensing. So like I mentioned, the mandible is the only movable cranial bone. That's your lower jawbone. So moving downward, we also have what's called the hyoid bone. This is really interesting in that it doesn't connect to any other bones. So a lot of our bones articulate. They're connected to other bones through ligaments, but the hyoid bone is just kind of on its own inside of soft tissue. So it doesn't contact any other bone. It's not a part of the skull. It's separate. So the hyoid also is really important for kind of figuring out cause of death, because if an individual is strangulated, if they're choked, that might break the hyoid. Okay, so moving downward from that, we have the vertebral column. This is also called your spine or your spinal column. It consists of vertebrae, which are separated from one another but connected by these connective tissue that are called intervertebral discs. And so if you talk about discs in your spine, that's what you're referring to. Those kind of create cushioning, they absorb shock, they keep things spaced out and curved the correct way. And the purpose of your spine is to support your head, neck, and body, and then also protect your spinal cord. There's different types of vertebrae. You do not need to memorize C1 through C7. You don't need to memorize these terms, but I want you to understand that from the top or the superior portion of your body down to the bottom or inferior portion, we have the cervical, which is at your neck, thoracic, which is at your thorax, your chest, lumbar, which is at your lower back, and then the sacrum and the coccyx, which are different fused vertebrae. So when you hear about lumbar support, it's referring to support of the lumbar vertebrae in your lower back. You should know that cervical means neck. You should know that thoracic is referring to thorax. And when I say that, I mean kind of in general for your biology education, because this is what learning the language of biology is all about, starting to recognize those terms and getting comfortable practicing them, especially if you're going into nursing or a physician's assistant position or medical school. So in the thoracic cage, that's the sternum and the ribs. The sternum is that breastbone that I mentioned earlier that the ribs articulate to. And then you all probably know what ribs are. Okay, so that was the axial skeleton. Now getting into the appendicular skeleton, or the appendage skeleton with our arms and legs. So your upper limbs, your arms, are really mobile. They move around a lot. Even as I'm talking to you, even though you can't see me, I'm moving my hands a lot. And so your upper limbs are very mobile. They have a lot of different functions, whereas the goal of your lower limbs is really weight bearing. So they kind of hold up the rest of your body and they provide stability. So that means that they kind of have different relative sizes. And even though our ancestors were tetrapods, they walked on all four legs. Even though we have roughly the same bones as dogs and cats, the shape of them, the anatomy and physiology is a little bit different because our upper limbs have different demands than our lower limbs. So those limbs connect to the axial skeleton at what are called girdles. When you think about pectoral, you might think about pecs, like your chest muscles. So the pectoral girdle is this kind of connection point of the upper limbs to your chest. So it consists of the shoulder blades, the scapulae, and the collarbone, the clavicles. So the shoulder blades and the clavicles connect your arms to the rest of your body. Your upper limb moving from proximal to distal, so the attachment to your body out towards your hands. You have the humerus, the funny bone. You have the ulna and radius. The radius is kind of on the outside portion towards your pinky. The ulna is on the inside portion towards your thumb. You have carpals, metacarpals, and phalanges. You can summarize those all as wrist and hand bones. So the pelvic girdle connects at your pelvis, so it connects your lower limbs to your axial skeleton. It consists of the hip bones, so the coxal bones. When you're born, those consist of the separate ilium, ischium, and pubis, but by the time you're an adult, those all fuse together. There's also a pubic arch or a pubic symphysis, which is a special type of joint that's between the two hip bones. So then getting into your lower limb, and again moving from the attachment at your body down to your feet, we have the femur, the patella. So your elbow doesn't have an equivalent to your patella, which is your kneecap. That's unique to your lower limbs. Then you have the tibia and fibula. The tibia is towards the inside portion of your body, so it's what we call medial. The fibula is on the outside portion lined up with your pinky toes, and there's a very big size difference between them that we don't see in the ulna and radius. And then getting into your ankle and feet bones, we have tarsals, metatarsals, and phalanges. The word tarsal means foot, and so we had carpal, metacarpal, and phalanges on our hands. On our feet, we have tarsals, metatarsals, and phalanges. And so those are pictured here. That word tarsal again means foot. All right, so when we're thinking about how these how these bones connect together, what we're thinking about are joints. We're thinking about articulations. So this is where bones or bones and cartilage come together. They might provide stability or movement or both, but in general, as one increases, the other decreases. So the more stable a joint is, the less movement we have at that joint. The more movement we have at the joint, the less stable it is. So when we're thinking about classification of joints, we might do it by degree of movement. And so I wanted to kind of break down some words really fast. So when you see that word arth, the kind of prefix there, you might think about arthritis. The word arthroon means to fasten by a joint. So when you think about arth, you should think about joint. Arthrosis is a process, a condition, or a pathological state. An itis is inflammation or swelling. So arthrosis is the type of joint. Arthritis is inflammation or swelling at a joint. When we think about syn, that means together. So like synergy or synthesis, that means something's happening together. So synarthrosis is a joint that moves together. Amphi, you might think about amphiphilic or amphibian. That means both. So an amphiarthrosis is a joint that kind of moves both together and separately. And then di means two. So a diarthrosis is a joint that moves as two separate entities. So when we define those, again, synarthrosis, it means that the joint is moving together. It's immobile. It's something like your cranial sutures, which are what we call the joints in your skull after those bones fuse together. So they kind of move as though they're one entity, not like they're separate bones. Amphiarthrosis means that it's kind of in between. There's limited mobility, some stability. So this is like your vertebrae. It's not super flexible, but you can still kind of bend your spine around and move it, hopefully not too much, but there's some limited mobility there. Diarthrosis means that it moves as if it's two separate entities. So the bones that connect at that joint are freely moving, This is something like your shoulder. So there's a lot of flexibility at your shoulder. We also define joints structurally, so we can define them as fibrous, cartilaginous, synovial. You don't need to memorize this for the exam. It would actually make a lot more sense once you take anatomy, but I want to kind of prepare you for that. So just keep in mind that the type of connective tissue that's at that joint makes a difference for how we classify it. The one that I want to point out specifically is synovial. So synovial joints have a fluid-filled cavity, and the lubricating fluid allows movement. Most of the joints in our body are synovial joints. They're very common. They're what we usually think about when we think about joints. So if we're looking at kind of a simplified model of a synovial joint, we can see that there's two bones and there's this fluid-filled joint cavity between them. So even though this joint brings together two bones, the bones are not physically touching. So they're not continuous with one another, and so we have this articular cartilage kind of surrounding the bone like we saw when we talked about long bones. That's important because they might bump into each other, but they're not physically connected. We also have the synovial membrane, which is important for secreting that synovial fluid, and we have the joint cavity, which reduces friction. So again, these are very common. They have a high degree of mobility. We also have the articular capsule kind of on the outside that forms the walls of the joint, and that's what's actually connecting these bones together. So this is what articulates the bones, even though it's on the very far outside and there's a lot of stuff happening on the inside, that's where the connection actually is. On your knee, you also have things like the meniscus, which further supports the connection between these joints. Or the connection between these bones, sorry about that. So when we're thinking about those synovial joints, they are freely moving, they're diarthroses, and they can also be characterized by how they move. So for example, when you look at your elbow, the actual function of the elbow is uniaxial. It's only operating on one plane of motion. So it's moving your hand towards your body or away from your body. If you kind of twist it around, we might think that the elbow is what's twisting. So for example, I'm currently flipping my hand from palm up to palm down. A lot of us might conflate that movement with the elbow, but that's actually happening at our shoulder. So it's not even happening at our wrist, it's happening at our shoulder. So the elbow itself is uniaxial. Our hands are biaxial. They can kind of move up and down, or sorry, our fingers can move kind of up and down and also side to side, away from each other and towards each other. So they're biaxial. And then something like our shoulder or our hip, which has rotational movement, is multiaxial. So of our synovial joints, there's 6 different types. There's the pivot joint, which is like at our neck. There's the hinge joint, which is like our elbow. Our knee is a modified hinge joint. There is the saddle joint in our kind of wrist and fingers, the plane joint between our foot bones, a condyloid joint at our wrist, and then there's the ball and socket joint. So the ball and socket is the type of synovial joint I want you to focus on. You should know that that is at the hips and the shoulders, and that it gives you the greatest range of motion. Okay, so getting into muscles, because muscles are what attach to bone and actually, do the moving. So there's different types of muscle tissue, and they all share some features in common. So they have a couple types of protein called actin and myosin. Whenever you see a word that ends in IN, that tells you that it's a protein. So for example, hemoglobin or biotin are proteins. Actin and myosin are proteins. So myosin is that protein that you can see in the middle of this GIF. Actin is much thinner, and so actin is pulled by myosin, and that's what contracts muscles. Muscles also require a lot of ATP, so they actually have tons of mitochondria inside of them. They relax when you kind of change the concentration of calcium ions. They're very excitable, they're elastic, they're extensible, and they're contractile. So those are all characteristics of muscles. Excitable means that they respond to a cell signal from the nervous system. Elastic means that they return to the way they were. Extensible means that they can extend, and contractile means that they can contract. So there are three types of muscle tissue. There's skeletal muscle. We call this striated muscle because the actin and myosin have a regular arrangement. So they have kind of stripes to them. They're also multinucleated, so a single cell or muscle fiber can have many, many nuclei. There's cardiac muscle, which is also striated. It might be multinucleated. It can have 2 nuclei per cell, but usually it only has 1 or 2. But all of the cells are electrically connected to one another. They kind of propagate their own signals and kind of coordinate those signals. And there's also smooth muscle, which is not striated, but does have very efficient protein structures. This one is different in that it only has 1 nucleus per cell. So when you go over histology in lab, I'm hoping that you'll get a chance to look at all of these. If you don't have that structured into the lab, you can always ask Clemencia, and she should be able to pull out skeletal, cardiac, and smooth muscle for you to look at if you want to. There's also really great images on Google Images if you'd like practice kind of identifying them separately. Okay, so I'm not sure how many of you played this game QWOP. It used to be kind of famous on the internet. It's where you kind of use the Q, W, O, and P keys on the keyboard to kind of coordinate this runner. It's very challenging and they fall a lot, and you're supposed to try to run laps with them. But it's a good lesson in the idea that just because bones are articulated together and they have connective tissue doesn't mean that they have stability. So that movement and stability comes from skeletal muscles. Those organs are super important for moving us around. But we also have what are called antagonistic muscle pairs. So this is something like your biceps and your triceps that work in opposition to one another and are constantly doing these small movements to keep us upright and stable. So these skeletal muscles are important for keeping bones and joints correctly aligned, not just attached to one another. Smooth muscle tracts end in skeletal muscle for increased control. So just because we have smooth muscle lining different tracts of our body, like our digestive system, doesn't mean that's enough. We still need skeletal muscles to control those tracts. And skeletal muscle is really important for homeostasis and support of internal organs. So skeletal muscle does a lot of stuff in our body. When we're thinking about the organization of skeletal muscles, those skeletal muscles are actually organs. So if we talk about our bicep, that's a unique organ. And so they're formed by skeletal muscle tissue, but also by kind of different layers, different tissue as well. So we have what's called the epimysium. This is important for maintaining structural integrity. It's kind of this layer on the outside of the organ. It protects the muscles from nearby tissue and other organs because the muscle's expanding, contracting, moving a lot. It needs a protective barrier. A lot of these terms are just to prepare you for anatomy. You do not need to memorize them for this class. So you do not need to know the term epimysium for this class. You should know the term fascicle. That's an organized bundle within the muscle tissue, and the nervous system actually targets those fascicles. So it targets those specific bundles, and then there's a connection with different neurons, which is called innervation. That connection happens at what's called the neuromuscular junction, or NMJ. that's going to be important when we talk about kind of muscle groups and also the nervous system. So we have what are called fibers inside of fascicles that are encased in endomysium. So epi means outside, endo means inside, my means muscle, and then sium is referring to the layer. So the epimysium is a layer on the outside of the muscle. The endomysium is a layer on the inside within those or within the fascicles encasing muscle fibers. And what we actually mean by fibers are the individual muscle cells. They're very long, they're very cylindrical, and they can actually be quite long, up to 30 centimeters. So remember, the reason that's possible is because they have many, many organelles. They have many nuclei per cell, so they have all those extra organelles in place to compensate for the fact that they don't have a high surface area to volume ratio. So you should know that a fiber is the word for an individual skeletal muscle cell. So like I said, a fiber is an individual skeletal muscle cell, and it consists of units called sarcomeres. So we see that word sarco quite a bit here. We see sarcolemma, we see sarcoplasm, we see myofibrils and striations. So we have sarcoplasm, which is kind of like the inside plasma of the cell. Myofibrils are muscle fibers, or kind of the structural components within the muscle fiber. And then the striations come from repeating units that we'll see on the next slide. So those myofibrils are structures within the muscle fibers. They have repeating units that are called sarcomeres. So the cell is the muscle fiber. The functional unit, what's actually doing the work, is the sarcomere. You are born with a set number of muscle fibers. You can't really change them, but you can increase or decrease your sarcomeres. So when you're building muscle, what you're actually doing is increasing the unit of sarcomeres. We define sarcomeres based on what are called Z lines. So as you can see the muscle contracting here, you see the Z lines getting closer together. So a sarcomere is from one Z line to the next Z line. We also have these other zones called A bands and H zones and I bands. When you get into physiology, you're going to definitely need to know those. Don't stress about them for this class. Just know that a sarcomere is the functional unit of a muscle cell. So when we're thinking about motor units, these are groups of muscles that are controlled by a single motor neuron. So we have coordinated function between muscle fibers or muscle cells. So we have a single neuron connecting to a group of muscle fibers, and that is called a motor unit. So when we have small, fine movements like our eye muscles, those are controlled by small motor units, so there's only about 6 cells connected to a single neuron. But when we have really big movements, like with our legs, our thigh, our back muscles, there might be thousands of cells hooked up to a single neuron. So that's when we have to do gross motor control, those really big movements. We also have what's called recruitment. So, your arm can do a lot of crazy varied things. Like it can do really small, gentle movements, but it can also maybe bench press or deadlift quite a lot of weight. And so we have also what's called recruitment, where we might have the involvement of increasingly higher threshold motor units. So we might have maybe lower threshold stuff where you just pick up a single feather, and then higher threshold over time. So the mechanism of excitability is kind of complex, and the relationship between muscles and nerves at the neuromuscular junction. We are going to talk about that type of cell signaling when we talk about the nervous system, but I don't want to introduce too much new material all at once. So I mentioned that when you build muscle, you're not actually adding any muscle cells, you're adding those muscle units. So you're adding sarcomeres. Hypertrophy is when you add structural proteins to the muscle fibers. That increases the diameter of the cell. It increases the size of the muscle fiber. Atrophy is when you lose structural proteins and you decrease in muscle mass. This is also called sarcopenia when it's age-related, so naturally people lose muscle mass when they get older. It also happens, like, for example, to astronauts who are in outer space and not subject to gravity. Their muscle starts to atrophy. This slide has a lot of information on it. I thought it would be interesting if you want to kind of see the difference between what aerobic exercise does versus weightlifting or anaerobic exercise. So when you do aerobic exercise, you're not necessarily going through hypertrophy, but you're not also going through atrophy. You're kind of changing all the other stuff that supports the cells. You're building mitochondria, you're increasing oxygen storage, you're increasing capillary networks to provide more blood flow, you're getting a higher surface area to volume ratio, but you're not building muscle fibers. When you weightlift, when you go through anaerobic exercise, you do increase your protein fibers, kind of the muscle components. You go through hypertrophy. But you're not kind of supporting it with everything else. So there's a lot of people who will just run and not weightlift, a lot of people who will weightlift and not run, but you kind of have to do both to fully support your muscle cells. Okay, so just very briefly, cardiac muscle is what's found in the heart. It's striated just like skeletal muscle. It's organized into sarcomeres. But there's shorter fibers and less nuclei per cell. They have lots of mitochondria, lots of myoglobin. The heart is a very dynamic muscle, so it needs a big supply of ATP and oxygen. Those cells are connected together through what are called intercalated discs that you can actually see on a histological slide. So you can kind of see those lines between cardiac muscle cells. And so those are very important because they have gap junctions. And remember that those gap junctions allow the flow of material, specifically in this case, electrochemical signals. There's also desmosomes, which we talked about, and those are what's going to connect those muscle fibers together. So they're going to be able to send electrochemical signals from one cell to the next, coordinate function, and then move together because of the desmosomes. Smooth muscle, we mentioned earlier, is not striated, but it still does have a unique organization that makes it very strong and efficient. It's found in the walls of hollow organs like your stomach, your urinary bladder, your uterus, your intestines, and also passageways like your arteries and veins, your respiratory tract, your urinary tract, and your reproductive system. It's also found in your eyes and skin. So the interesting thing about smooth muscle is we talked about our skeletal muscle as coordinating these movements that you really control. Your cardiac muscle, you don't necessarily control it voluntarily, but it does have a unique kind of type of control to it. Smooth muscle is autonomic, so we don't control it voluntarily. It acts unconsciously. Okay, so that's the lecture for today. Please make sure you review the quiz feedback when you're done taking it. Watch this video, which you already did. Check the study guide, which will be posted on Friday. I'm going to send out an email tomorrow with some study tips because I'm noticing that the quiz score for this week is quite low. I'm sure a lot of that has to do with Labor Day, but I also want to make sure that you guys are on track for the quizzes. Make sure you complete the online reflection when it's posted. Those are due every single Monday, so don't forget about those. And then complete the next quiz. And email me if you need any support at all.